In just 7 minutes, one woman, Jasmine Crockett, shook the mighty walls of Congress and shattered decades of comfortable silence. Where polished speeches once masked injustice, her voice cut through with the clarity of truth. In a chamber built to guard freedom, but often echoing the powerful, Jasmine stood, unshaken, unbowed, carrying not just her own hopes, but the silent prayers of millions who had long been unseen. What you are about to witness is a dramatization, a weaving of truth and imagination. Because sometimes fiction must rise where history leaves a void. The feelings are real, the struggle is real, and the fire that Jasmine lit still burns in all who dare to believe that justice must never whisper, it must roar. It all began on a morning like any other. Gray skies over Washington, a heavy stillness in the air. When Jasmine Crockett walked through the grand stone doors of Congress, unknowingly stepping straight into a storm that would test the very soul of a nation. Inside the grand halls of Congress, the usual hum of routine was replaced by something sharper, a certain tightness, a buzz just below hearing. Staffers moved a little quicker. Conversations dropped to low, cautious murmurs. At the heart of it all, Mike Johnson sat tall behind his desk in the committee chamber, his papers arranged in perfect, almost militant order. His navy suit was immaculate, his tie a touch too tight, his polished shoes tapping lightly against the carpeted floor. A small, nervous tell betraying his otherwise confident facade. Today was his day. He had crafted his arguments with precision, carefully lacing them with populist rhetoric. Words he knew would stir certain ears, ignite certain headlines. He wasn't here merely to debate. He was here to win, to make a statement against the excesses he believed had been creeping into American governance. Minority rights legislation, programs he dismissed as preferential treatment, were in his crosshairs. And in his mind, Jasmine Crockett was simply another young idealist who didn't understand how the real world worked. But he underestimated her. A few rows away, Jasmine Crockett adjusted the simple silver pin on her lapel. A small symbol, unnoticed by many, but for her a silent promise to those who had no seat at this table. She sat calm, composed, a stillness that, paradoxically, seemed to pulse with restrained energy. Her eyes flicked toward Mike Johnson briefly. She saw the stiff set of his jaw, the over-preparedness in the way he flipped through his notes, and she smiled. Just slightly, a smile so faint that anyone not paying close attention would have missed it entirely. Something was stirring in the air, and Jasmine felt it deep in her bones. Outside the chamber, the world rumbled quietly with unrest. Weeks of protests had rocked major cities. Stories of brutality, systemic injustice, quiet suffering spilled across airwaves and phone screens. And yet inside these walls, power still wrapped itself in polite language and procedural armor. The legislation on the table today was supposed to be a step forward, a modest expansion of protections for minority communities. Nothing radical, nothing revolutionary. Yet the resistance it sparked was fierce, almost panicked, a reminder of how fragile even the smallest victories could be. A voice crackled over the intercom. Session begins in 5 minutes. Mike Johnson straightened his spine, a hawk ready to swoop. Across the aisle, Jasmine took a slow, steady breath, in through her nose, out through her mouth, steadying herself not just for debate, but for battle. A soft clap of thunder rolled across the distant sky. Somewhere deep inside the Capitol, a window rattled. No one could have predicted it yet, but within the next hour, reputations would crumble, alliances would fracture, and the nation would be left grappling with questions far larger than a single piece of legislation. And it would all start with a few carefully chosen words and one woman's refusal to stay silent. The gavel fell once, sharp against the podium, and the chamber stirred to attention. Mike Johnson rose smoothly from his seat, papers in hand, exuding the kind of self-assured ease that only comes from rehearsing every word. His voice at first was measured, almost perfunctory, a formality performed 1,000 times before. He welcomed the committee members, noted the importance of today's session, and congratulated his colleagues on their dedication to preserving the principles that have guided our nation for generations. It was almost soothing, almost forgettable, almost. Then came the pivot. It was subtle at first, a slight tightening of his jaw, a sharper edge slipping into his tone as he leaned into the microphone. He spoke of ensuring fairness for all Americans, but laced it with words that carried a different weight when you listen closely. We must be vigilant, he said, against policies that favor some groups at the expense of others, against legislation that undermines the hard work and values that built this country. His gaze, casual but deliberate, swept across the chamber, lingering just a beat too long on the seats where the minority caucus sat. The words themselves were crafted with care, plausible deniability woven into every phrase. But the intent behind them was clear to anyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. Murmurs rippled through the room, faint at first, like the distant rustling before a storm. Some faces tightened into polite masks, others, less guarded, betrayed their reactions more openly. A few conservative members smiled thinly, exchanging glances of quiet approval. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the rising tension, but unwilling, or perhaps unable, to step outside the carefully drawn lines of decorum. Jasmine Crockett sat utterly still, her hands folded neatly atop the desk in front of her. Only the tightening of her fingers, the subtle whitening of her knuckles betrayed the effort it took to keep her composure. She had heard words like these before, soft weapons disguised as civility. She recognized the strategy. Plant the seed of resentment, water it with fear, harvest division. Mike continued, growing bolder now, sensing the lack of immediate pushback. America was not built on special privileges, he declared, voice rising slightly. It was built on equal opportunity, earned, not given. His rhetoric danced along the edge of insult, never fully crossing the line but daring someone to call him out. Jasmine's jaw set tightly, her pulse drumming a steady beat against the hollow of her throat. She would not be baited. Not yet. Timing was everything. Let him overreach. Let him reveal himself fully before she made her move. Another murmur rippled through the room, louder this time. The storm was not yet here, but the first drops had fallen, and everyone inside that chamber could feel the air thickening, heavy with the electric promise of confrontation. Jasmine's fingers relaxed slightly, her breath slowing. She had been underestimated before. She would not be underestimated again. She leaned back in her chair just a fraction, eyes narrowing slightly, watching, waiting, for the exact moment the storm would break. Jasmine Crockett sat motionless, but inside a different storm was gathering. Mike Johnson's words buzzed in her ears, not because they surprised her, but because they were so familiar. They echoed the polished condescension she had heard in courtrooms, in boardrooms, in whispered conversations behind closed doors. They carried the same scent of supremacy masked as concern, the same cold dismissal of struggles too real to be sanitized by rhetoric. As Mike continued, weaving his arguments into a net of half-truths and subtle threats, Jasmine's mind slipped, for just a moment, into the past. She remembered the first time she had truly understood what injustice looked like. Not in the history books, but in the look on her mother's face the day their family was denied housing in a better neighborhood, despite having the means, the credentials, the dreams. She remembered her first courtroom battle as a young lawyer, standing alone against a system designed to drown out voices like hers. She remembered the promises she had made to herself in those moments. Promises forged not in ambition, but in survival. Her nails pressed into the soft leather of her chair's armrest, grounding herself back to the present. She would not forget who she was, not here, not now. Not today, she thought, the words forming like steel inside her chest. Today she would not let the comfortable lies slide unchallenged. She would not let the polished venom of Mike Johnson pass as reasoned debate. She would not allow the chamber, the country, the world, to pretend they hadn't heard the quiet vilifications hidden in his speech. Mike shifted gears now, speaking more freely, emboldened by the lack of resistance. He painted a picture of an America under siege, not by foreign powers, but by its own citizens, those seeking, as he framed it, special privileges under the guise of equality. Jasmine felt the weight of every eye in the room, some heavy with expectation, others wary with fear. She could sense the way the story was being written in real time, who the villains would be, who the heroes were supposed to be, and she burned with the knowledge that if she stayed silent, her absence would be used to validate the very lies she had sworn to fight. Yet still she waited. Timing was everything. Let Mike reveal himself fully. Let him climb higher and higher on the scaffolding of his own arrogance before she struck the first blow. Her breathing slowed, deepened, her gaze sharpened. She wasn't just preparing to respond, she was preparing to expose. Mike glanced briefly across the room, his lips curving into the faintest shadow of a smirk. He tapped his stack of papers once, lightly, almost playfully, as if signaling that what had come so far was merely the preamble. Leaning slightly into the microphone, he let his voice drop into a more conversational, almost conspiratorial tone. "And friends," he said with a wry chuckle, "we're only just getting started." The words hung in the chamber like the first crack of thunder in a sky about to break open, and Jasmine, sitting perfectly still, made a silent vow. When the storm finally hit, she would be ready to meet it head-on, and she would not yield. Mike Johnson leaned into the microphone again, a calculated glint in his eye. The notes before him nothing more than a formality now. His voice, smooth and self-assured, wrapped the room like a velvet curtain, almost comforting if one didn't listen too closely. "Let's be clear," he began, flashing a genial smile that barely concealed the sharpened edge beneath. "Programs designed to assist minority communities have for too long strayed from their noble intentions. What started as a hand-up has, in many cases, become a handout, creating dependency rather than empowerment." He paused, letting the words settle, fishing for nods of agreement among the more conservative members lining the chamber. A few obliged, their expressions carefully schooled but unmistakably complicit. Jasmine Crockett sat motionless, her face unreadable, but inside her mind was a whir of calculations. Mike wasn't just making vague insinuations now. He was launching a direct assault, manipulating half-truths, bending the historical record to suit his narrative. He referenced selective statistics, one stripped of context, to suggest that minority aid programs had ballooned into wasteful entitlements. He cited exaggerated anecdotes, cherry-picked stories of fraud and failure, painting them as representative of entire communities. He was building a case, layer by poisonous layer, hoping that repetition would breed belief. His tone grew more confident with every word, every casual distortion. He spoke not to the room itself, but to the invisible audience beyond these walls. A certain slice of the American public that clung to myths of meritocracy like a security blanket, eager to believe that systemic barriers were nothing more than excuses. Mike fed them what they craved, a narrative where the disadvantaged were not victims of injustice, but architects of their own demise. Jasmine listened, dissecting every claim as he spoke, every misrepresentation, every omission, every clever sleight of hand. Her training as an attorney kicked into high gear, cataloging each flawed premise, each manipulated figure. She didn't flinch. She didn't shake her head or roll her eyes. She simply watched and listened, collecting the ammunition she would need when her moment came. Timing, she reminded herself, was everything. Strike too early and you seem emotional. Strike too late and the lie becomes the truth. You had to know exactly when the foundation of a false argument was weakest, and hit it with precision. Mike, oblivious to the gathering storm across the aisle, pressed on. He invoked the names of historical figures out of context, implying that those who fought for civil rights would somehow disapprove of modern efforts to level the playing field. He framed privilege as myth and discrimination as a relic of a bygone era, dismissing lived experiences with the ease of a man who had never been asked to explain his own existence. The more he spoke, the more Jasmine felt the fire build within her, not a reckless, blinding anger, but a focused, disciplined heat. She was not here to scream. She was here to reveal, to dismantle, to show the world exactly how deception thrived when left unchallenged. Mike finally paused, taking a sip of water, mistaking the silence in the chamber for acquiescence. Jasmine's gaze never wavered. She knew something Mike did not. Silence was not surrender. It was strategy. And very soon that strategy would pay off in a way he would never see coming. The fire inside Jasmine Crockett burned hot, but her expression remained cool, composed, almost indifferent. Rage had risen swiftly, like a tide against the dam of her restraint, but she knew better than to let it spill. Anger, unleashed, was a weapon that could cut both ways. Anger, mastered, was power sharpened to a lethal edge. She let it simmer beneath the surface, refining it, compressing it into something far more dangerous than outrage. Cold, lucid clarity. Her hand moved slowly, deliberately, across the notepad before her. She didn't write full sentences or scripted speeches. She jotted fragments, pressure points, exposed weaknesses, hidden contradictions in Mike Johnson's tirade. Strategic notes carved out with the precision of a surgeon planning an incision. Every claim he made was a thread, and Jasmine's mind was already weaving them into a noose he would hang himself with. Dependency programs? She had the data. Misuse of civil rights icons? She had the historical context. The myth of meritocracy? She had the lived realities that no spreadsheet could erase. She mapped them quickly, instinctively, the way a seasoned litigator prepares to dismantle a hostile witness. She was no stranger to this kind of combat. In courtrooms across the country, she had learned the subtle dance of patience and precision, how to let an opponent overextend, how to feign stillness while sharpening the knife. Mike spoke on, his voice a smug river flowing unchecked, and Jasmine let the words wash over her without reacting, noting each shift in his tone, each casual omission, each strategic half-truth. He believed himself safe behind his rhetorical flourishes, his carefully chosen euphemisms. But Jasmine knew the truth hid not in what he said, but in what he left unsaid. She traced those absences like a tracker following footprints through a dense forest, knowing they would lead her exactly where she needed to strike. She glanced around the chamber briefly. Some members were visibly restless. Others leaned forward, invested in the narrative Mike was spinning. The room was splitting, not along party lines, but along lines of belief. Those who wanted desperately to cling to the myth of fairness, and those who recognized the stench of discrimination, however sweetly it was perfumed. Jasmine felt the weight of their expectations, their silent questions, pressing against her. Would she challenge him? Could she? She allowed herself a brief, slow breath. Yes, and not with volume, not with anger, not with personal outrage. She would challenge him with facts, with history, with the unvarnished mirror of reality. And when she spoke, she would not shout him down. She would calmly and methodically dismantle him piece by piece until there was nothing left but the hollow shell of his arguments echoing back at him. Her fingers tapped the pen once against the pad, a small, steady signal to herself. Almost time. She looked up, locking eyes with Mike for just a second. He didn't notice. He was too busy basking in the sound of his own voice to realize the ground beneath him was already shifting. Jasmine set her pen down gently, sat back, and waited, steady as steel. Her anger, once ablaze, had cooled into something infinitely more dangerous. Strategy. Mike Johnson's voice tapered off with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to closing arguments. He stacked his papers with an almost theatrical finality, offering a tight smile to the room, as if daring anyone to challenge the portrait he had so carefully painted. A beat of silence followed, a silence loaded with expectation, discomfort, even admiration from certain corners. Then, as if on cue, polite applause rippled through the chamber, scattered and thin, a formality more than a fervent endorsement. Mike basked in it, mistaking courtesy for consensus, arrogance blinding him to the shifting current that had been building steadily beneath the surface. Across the aisle, Jasmine Crockett rose slowly to her feet. She didn't slam her chair back or make any grand gestures. She simply stood, and the entire room seemed to register the movement at once. Conversations ceased mid-sentence. Hands froze halfway to coffee cups. A stillness swept across the chamber, sudden and absolute, as if the very air had thickened with anticipation. Jasmine adjusted the microphone with a deliberate, almost meditative calm, her fingers steady. She cleared her throat once, a soft but commanding sound that seemed to echo against the high marble ceilings. She didn't rush. She didn't fumble with papers or shuffle notes. Her presence alone demanded the attention Mike had spent 20 minutes clawing for. and she hadn't spoken a single word yet. When she did, her voice was steady, low, and resonant, cutting through the tension like a bell through morning fog. "Mr. Chairman, distinguished members of the committee," she began, her tone respectful but devoid of any performative deference. "I have listened carefully to the remarks presented here today, and while I appreciate the passion with which my colleague speaks, passion must never be allowed to substitute for truth." The first sentence landed like a thunderclap. There was no shouting, no melodrama, only the clean, surgical strike of language wielded with purpose. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The weight of her words did the work for her, settling over the room like an undeniable fact. She continued methodically, dismantling the narrative Mike had so carefully constructed. Programs designed to address historic and systemic inequities are not handouts. They are acknowledgments, imperfect, overdue, and often insufficient, of realities too painful for many to confront. Her voice tightened, not with anger, but with conviction. When we reduce these efforts to mere charity, we insult not only those who have struggled, but the very ideals this nation claims to uphold. Mike shifted slightly in his seat, the earlier smugness on his face flickering, cracking. Jasmine pressed forward, laying out statistics with clinical precision, providing context where he had ripped it away, stitching back the tapestry of truth he had so carelessly shredded. She quoted history, real history, not sanitized sound bites, invoking the struggles of those who had bled and sacrificed for rights still too often denied. She exposed the logical fallacies buried within Mike's arguments, not with contempt, but with a ruthless kind of compassion, as if offering him a chance to see his own reflection clearly for the first time. Every sentence she delivered was a deliberate stroke, and with each the temperature in the room shifted. The applause that had greeted Mike's conclusion now felt like an echo from another world, a place where bravado could pass for wisdom. Here now only substance mattered. Jasmine stood rooted in that truth, unwavering, and for the first time that morning, the storm she had sensed brewing was no longer distant. It was here, and she was its voice. Jasmine Crockett stood firm, her figure composed against the stark lighting of the chamber, as if carved from the very granite that lined the Capitol walls. She didn't rush. Her voice remained steady, her cadence deliberate, giving each word the weight it deserved. The air was taut, every eye trained on her, every breath collectively held in the room that moments ago had been indifferent. She began by revisiting Mike Johnson's points, not with mockery or disdain, but with a surgical precision that left no room for misinterpretation. Each flawed argument he had presented was held up to the light, examined, and then quietly dismantled. "You speak of fairness, Mr. Johnson," she said, her tone level but laced with steel. "But fairness without context is not justice. It is a hollow performance." She recited the statistics he had twisted, restoring the full picture he had omitted. How minority support programs had not only lifted communities, but strengthened the economy at large, creating opportunities far beyond the targeted groups. She called out the selective storytelling, the elevation of rare abuses over overwhelming successes, and she did so with a demeanor that was calm, almost clinical, as if inviting the room to see the facts for themselves, not merely take her word for it. Mike shifted in his seat, an involuntary tick betraying his discomfort. He opened his mouth once, perhaps to interrupt, but thought better of it under the unblinking scrutiny of the chamber. Then came the pivot, the moment Jasmine had been building toward. She paused, letting a heavy, expectant silence fill the room before she spoke again. "Mr. Johnson has invoked the spirit of our founding fathers, suggesting that current efforts toward equity somehow betray the principles upon which this country was built." Her gaze swept across the room, gathering the attention of even the most disinterested listeners. "But let us not forget the words that form the very spine of our democracy." She leaned forward slightly, voice dropping into a resonant, commanding tone as she quoted, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility." The words rang out, ancient yet immediate, stitching past to present in a seamless thread. Jasmine let them hang there, heavy and undeniable, before she continued. Not some people, not privileged people. We the people. Justice was not an afterthought. It was a mission. Her voice sharpened, a blade honed by conviction. And every effort we make today to correct historic and systemic injustice is not a betrayal of that mission. It is its fulfillment. A ripple coursed through the room, subtle but unmistakable. Some leaned back in their seats, arms crossed in contemplation. Others nodded, almost unconsciously, the truth of her words disarming the ingrained reflex to resist. Even some who had applauded Mike earlier sat now in a stiff silence, caught between loyalty to their political lines and the simple, brutal force of the Constitution's promise spoken aloud. Mike Johnson's face had tightened into an unreadable mask, but his hands betrayed him, fingers drumming an uneven rhythm against the table. Jasmine held her ground, giving no quarter, no apology for the truth she wielded. She didn't shout, she didn't plead, she simply stood in the fullness of history's judgment, letting her words do the work of 1,000 protests. And for a few fragile moments, it was as if the chamber itself, built by imperfect men chasing an impossible dream, recognized the better angels of its nature stirring awake. Mike Johnson shifted in his seat, the set of his jaw tightening as the weight of Jasmine's words settled heavily over the chamber. For a fleeting moment, he hesitated, visibly wrestling with the sudden and unwelcome reality that he had lost control of the narrative. Then, like a man drowning who mistakes thrashing for swimming, he lunged for the floor, interrupting without ceremony. "If I may respond," he began, his voice cutting across the chamber with a forced casualness that barely masked the agitation underneath. The chairman, caught off guard, looked briefly uncertain, but Jasmine, still standing firm, did not yield. She turned her gaze to Mike, steady and unflinching, and without raising her voice, resumed her rebuttal as if the interruption had never happened. Mike's face flushed, a blotchy red rising up his neck. He tried again, louder this time. "With all due respect, Congresswoman, perhaps you're misunderstanding the complexity of the issues at hand?" The words hung in the air, heavy with the unmistakable stink of condescension. Several heads turned sharply at the remark. Some frowned, others smirked, waiting to see if Jasmine would take the bait. Mike pressed on, emboldened by the sound of his own voice, believing that if he could rattle her, if he could make her seem emotional, uncomposed, he could reclaim the authority he had so clearly lost. "You see," he continued, injecting a smug, patronizing tone that dripped like oil, "these matters aren't just about slogans or emotional appeals. They require a certain intellectual rigor." His insinuation was clear as glass. She wasn't smart enough. He smiled thinly, confident that the room would absorb his message without him having to say the ugly part aloud. The pause that followed was razor-thin but seismic. Jasmine did not flinch. She did not bristle. She did not react the way Mike had hoped she would. Instead, she let the silence stretch just a fraction longer than was comfortable, letting everyone in the room sit with the full, naked implication of Mike's words. When she spoke, her voice was calm, almost gentle, but carried a force that cracked through the tension like a whip. "Congressman," she said, her tone edged with an iciness more cutting than any shout could have been, "respect is not optional. It's constitutional." The room froze. Some inhaled sharply. Others sat back in their chairs as if they had just witnessed a fault line split open beneath them. The few who had been snickering moments before now shifted uncomfortably, realizing the tide had not just turned, it had thundered inland, unstoppable and undeniable. Jasmine stepped forward half a pace, her presence expanding, not through volume, but through the sheer inevitability of her command. "The Constitution guarantees equality, dignity, and the right for every citizen, regardless of background, to speak, to advocate, to fight for a more perfect union." She let her words sink in, her eyes never leaving Mike's. "That includes me. That includes those you dismiss so casually with coded language and careful insults." Mike opened his mouth but found no words ready to defend himself. He looked around, seeking reinforcement, but found only uneasy silence. The room, once eager to applaud him, now sat shackled by its own discomfort, unwilling to step into the shadow of what he had just revealed about himself. Jasmine allowed a brief, measured breath before she continued, her voice unwavering. We are not here to relitigate the worth of entire communities. We are here to ensure that the promises of this nation apply to all its people, not just the ones it has historically favored. And with that, the gavel of moral authority, once assumed to be Mike's, passed quietly but irrevocably into her hands. Jasmine Crockett stood a moment longer, letting the charged silence solidify around her like a fortress. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she reached down and lifted a slim folder from the desk in front of her. The simple act, so understated, drew the attention of every eye in the chamber. It wasn't theatrics, it wasn't drama, it was a lawyer presenting evidence, and the room instinctively recognized the shift. Jasmine flipped the folder open and pulled out a thin sheaf of papers, official reports, government audits, verified studies, and without raising her voice, began to speak again, this time armed with more than principle, armed with fact. According to the Congressional Research Service report published last quarter, she said, her tone crisp and surgical, programs aimed at closing the racial wealth gap have led to a 24% increase in first-generation homeownership over the past 5 years. She moved to the next page, her cadence steady. A study by the Department of Education indicates that targeted scholarship programs for underrepresented communities have resulted in a 28% higher graduation rate compared to the national average, with correlating increases in lifetime earning potential. She paused only long enough to let the numbers sink in before continuing. These are not handouts. These are investments in American potential, investments that have shown measurable returns, not just for individuals, but for our nation's economy as a whole. Mike Johnson shifted in his seat again, his earlier smugness curdling into something else, something taut and defensive. Jasmine could see it. More importantly, everyone else could see it too. She turned a page, unfurling a different kind of evidence now. Personal testimonies, stories distilled from thousands of voices into a few piercing truths. Testimony from a veteran in Detroit who, thanks to targeted housing grants, secured stable housing after years of homelessness. She flipped another page. A young woman from Mississippi who, with the help of minority-focused STEM programs, became the first in her family to graduate from college and now works as a biomedical engineer. She let their stories speak where statistics alone could not, stitching humanity into the cold fabric of numbers. Around the chamber, faces shifted. Some softened with awe and reluctant respect. Others hardened into resentment, as if clinging to their cynicism were the only defense against the dismantling of their illusions. But the shift was undeniable. The ground was moving beneath them, and they all knew it. Mike opened his mouth once, as if to object, but no words came. The language of falsehoods and half-truths had failed him here, in this room, against this woman. His hands fidgeted on the tabletop, fingers drumming a frantic, uneven rhythm that betrayed the turmoil he could no longer conceal. Jasmine closed the folder gently and placed it back on the desk, as if to say, "The evidence speaks for itself." She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. Victory, she understood, was not in humiliating an opponent. It was in revealing a truth so undeniable that it stood on its own, requiring neither embellishment nor applause. A low murmur began to ripple through the chamber, not loud but persistent, like the first tremors before a seismic shift. Staffers whispered. Lawmakers exchanged glances, calculating and recalculating their positions in real time. Jasmine stood perfectly still amidst the gathering storm she had unleashed, the eye of a moral hurricane, while Mike Johnson sat rattled and visibly diminished, a man who had once commanded the room now scrambling to salvage his own crumbling authority. And for the first time that morning, the chamber wasn't just watching, it was listening. Jasmine Crockett stood still, the echo of the murmurs fading around her, the folder of evidence now closed, her weapons of fact and testimony neatly set aside. She had dismantled Mike Johnson's arguments, stripped them to their hollow bones. But she knew her purpose wasn't simply to win a debate. It wasn't about besting an opponent or scoring political points. It was about something far larger, far more sacred. She took a breath, slow and deliberate, and pivoted, not as a politician defending a position, but as a voice speaking for those whose cries had long been swallowed by the indifferent hum of power. Her tone softened, but somehow grew stronger, reaching beyond the chamber walls into the invisible places where the forgotten lived. Today, she said, her voice steady, we are not merely discussing policy or budget allocations. We are speaking about people, about Americans who live every day under the crushing weight of being unseen. She paused, letting the gravity of her words stretch across the room. Single mothers working 2, sometimes 3 jobs, still wondering if they can keep the lights on another month. Veterans who wore the flag on their shoulders but now sleep in their cars because promises made in marble halls have long since crumbled into dust. Young activists, full of hope and fury, marching through streets demanding a seat at a table that was never built with them in mind. A hush fell deeper over the chamber, as if the very oxygen had thickened, demanding attention, demanding heart. Jasmine's voice held firm, but a tremor flickered briefly at the edge of a sentence, betraying the depth of what she carried. It wasn't weakness. It was humanity. The raw, unvarnished kind that couldn't be faked, couldn't be staged. For a split second, the carefully controlled cadence cracked and the chamber leaned in, caught by the authenticity of a woman refusing to armor herself against the sorrow she named. These are not statistics. They are not talking points, she continued, her voice recovering its composure, fortified by the very vulnerability she had allowed to show. They are our neighbors, our soldiers, our children, and they deserve not charity, not pity, but justice. Her words rang with an urgency that cut deeper than any accusation, a demand not for applause but for reckoning. Faces around the chamber shifted once again. Some lawmakers looked away, unable to meet the mirror she held up. Others sat transfixed, their defenses eroding under the simple, undeniable truth that she laid bare. Even those who had entered the room with folded arms and hardened hearts now found themselves unsettled, confronted with images too vivid to dismiss. Mike Johnson sat motionless, his earlier bravado drained, replaced by the stony silence of a man who realizes the ground he stands on is giving way. He was no longer simply losing an argument. He was witnessing a narrative being rewritten before his eyes, one in which he was no longer the author. Jasmine's hands stayed loose at her sides, her shoulders squared not in defiance, but in responsibility. She wasn't speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for them, for all of them, and her voice, cracking and rising, became a vessel through which the silence roared. In that moment, the chamber wasn't just a place of governance. It was a battleground between the comfortable fictions of the past and the uncomfortable truths of the present. And standing at the center of it all, unyielding, was Jasmine Crockett, the voice for the voiceless, the storm they had all tried so long to pretend wasn't coming. Mike Johnson, who had spent the better part of the morning weaving careful narratives and wielding quiet superiority, now found himself scrambling in the ruins of his own undoing. His fingers fidgeted restlessly on the desk, tapping out a staccato beat that betrayed the calm front he was desperately trying to project. Then, in a tone far sharper than before, he leaned into his microphone, forcing a tight smile. "Well," he drawled, "that was a stirring performance. Almost makes me wish we lived in the America you're describing, Congresswoman." The words dripped with sarcasm, the last refuge of a man who had run out of facts and found no other weapon but ridicule. A few scattered chuckles fluttered weakly around the chamber, more nervous reflex than genuine amusement. But they died quickly in the heavy air Jasmine had created. Mike pressed on, misrepresenting her points with reckless abandon, distorting her advocacy into caricature, painting her as naive, emotional, disconnected from the real struggles of real Americans. He leaned into old tropes, hoping to provoke her, hoping to bait her into anger, into defensiveness, into anything that could be spun later into a soundbite about the overreach of emotion in governance. But Jasmine Crockett did not take the bait. She stood there, poised, unshaken, the very picture of strategic patience. A faint, almost imperceptible smile played at the corner of her mouth. Not mockery, not disdain, but something gentler, sadder, as if she were witnessing a man dismantle himself, piece by graceless piece. When she finally spoke, her voice was light, almost playful, but laced with a truth that struck harder than any shouted rebuttal. "You may twist my words, Congressman," she said, tilting her head just slightly, the movement casual but deliberate. "But you cannot twist the truth." The words dropped into the chamber like a stone into still water, sending ripples that no sarcasm could smother. There was no need for volume, no need for theatrics, just the quiet certainty of a person standing on bedrock while another flailed in quicksand. Mike opened his mouth again, but the momentum was no longer his to command. Every attempt at deflection, every slanted jab he threw now seemed petty, desperate, clumsy. Jasmine, meanwhile, responded with dignity, wrapped in an armor of humor, acknowledging his distortions with the raised eyebrow of someone who had seen far worse from far more dangerous adversaries. She corrected his misrepresentations not with heated denials, but with clarifications so crisp and undeniable that any effort to twist them further would only expose his own desperation. The chamber, once divided by politics and prejudice, now found itself united by a different instinct altogether. The instinct to recognize, however begrudgingly, when one side had not just won, but revealed itself to be undeniably right. Mike's voice faltered, trailing into a muttered half-sentence he couldn't quite rescue. And for a moment, he sat back, his hands finally still, the fight draining from his posture. Jasmine remained standing, not triumphant, not gloating, but resolute, an immovable reminder that sometimes the real victory is not in the shouting match, but in the unwavering refusal to abandon the truth. The shift was almost imperceptible at first, a slight rustling of papers, a subtle exchange of glances, the soft clearing of throats that rippled through the chamber like the first tremors of an unseen quake. What had begun as murmurs, cautious and tentative, now evolved into low conversations carried on in hushed, urgent tones. Staffers leaned toward their principals, whispering rapid assessments. Committee members who had sat stiff and unresponsive began to move, their bodies angling toward Jasmine, as if pulled by a force they couldn't quite explain. The air, once thick with Mike Johnson's overconfidence, now vibrated with a different energy altogether, an energy that no longer belonged to him. Some of the Democratic members nodded subtly, the kind of instinctive acknowledgement born not out of political allegiance, but out of something rarer: respect. Even among the Republicans, shifts were happening, small but undeniable. A few exchanged tight, uncomfortable glances, recalculating silently in their minds, weighing the risk of being tethered to a sinking ship against the instinct for self-preservation. The lines that had once seemed so clear, so rigid, now blurred under the relentless pressure of truth. It was no longer a matter of party or ideology. It was a matter of credibility. And in that arena, Jasmine Crockett had seized the high ground with breathtaking precision. The media, ever attuned to the scent of a changing tide, responded in kind. Cameras that had spent the better part of the morning panning lazily across the room now pivoted sharply. Lenses focusing not on Mike Johnson, who sat increasingly isolated behind his crumbling defenses, but on Jasmine, her figure poised, her face a portrait of composure and conviction. Microphones angled subtly to capture her every word. Journalists scribbled notes faster, their expressions shifting from detached observation to barely concealed excitement. They knew a story when they saw one, and today Jasmine Crockett was the story. Mike, sensing the attention slipping irreversibly away from him, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He glanced around the room, looking for allies, for familiar faces willing to meet his eye, but found only a sea of averted gazes and stone expressions. The power he had wielded so confidently hours earlier had drained from him like water through cupped hands, and he was left with nothing but the brittle remnants of a narrative no one was willing to carry forward. Jasmine, by contrast, radiated a quiet command that filled the chamber without effort. She was no longer defending herself, no longer responding to accusations. She was defining the terms of the conversation, setting the frame through which everyone else would now have to operate. It was the difference between reacting and leading, between surviving and shaping destiny. She had crossed an invisible threshold, And everyone in that room, whether they admitted it aloud or not, knew it. The chairman, who had tried so hard to maintain a semblance of neutrality, now watched Jasmine with something resembling awe, or perhaps caution, recognizing that the momentum of the session had veered far beyond his control. A few seats away, aides typed frantically on their devices, drafting statements that would later attempt to capture the moment without admitting just how thoroughly the ground had shifted beneath them. Jasmine remained rooted, unmoved by the swirl around her. She hadn't come seeking adulation, nor did she revel in Mike's unraveling. She understood something deeper, that real change didn't announce itself with fireworks. It crept forward one heart, one mind at a time, until suddenly the landscape was different and there was no going back. And in that moment, as the buzz grew louder and the cameras bore down, Jasmine Crockett didn't just stand in the chamber, she owned it. At first, it was just a few smartphones raised discreetly at the back of the chamber. Staffers and aides who had learned to recognize when history might be unfolding before their eyes. Then the notifications began trickling out, short, shaky clips posted to social media, snapshots of Jasmine Crockett standing firm, her voice slicing cleanly through the old noise of politics as usual. In those early seconds, a few dozen viewers tuned in. Within minutes, it was hundreds, then thousands, then tens of thousands. Screens began lighting up across America, like stars blinking into existence against a darkening sky. In quiet kitchens, in bustling coffee shops, in the flickering glow of living rooms where news channels played more out of habit than hope, people found themselves pausing, mid-sip, mid-sentence, to watch. The footage wasn't slick or overproduced. It was raw, immediate, alive with the kind of authenticity that couldn't be manufactured. It was Jasmine's words, clear and unflinching, refusing to be twisted or diminished, resonating across divides wider than any political aisle, in communities often forgotten by the very institutions that claimed to represent them. The impact was electric. Veterans hunched over worn recliners felt a long-forgotten stirring in their chests as Jasmine invoked promises they had once fought to defend. Single mothers wiping down diner counters paused, letting the rag hang limp in their hands, listening to a woman who spoke not just at them, but for them. Retirees sitting alone at kitchen tables, their televisions tuned habitually to endless cycles of outrage and disappointment, blinked against the sudden sting of unexpected tears. "She's saying what we lived," murmured a gray-haired man in Ohio, turning up the volume. "She's saying what nobody else will say anymore." A grandmother in Birmingham, Alabama, clutched her rosary tighter, whispering prayers of gratitude for a voice she didn't know, but instantly trusted. In Denver, a retired school teacher forwarded a clip to her children, captioned simply, "You need to hear this." The hashtags exploded across platforms. Chaque voice for the voiceless, a respect is constitutional, already Sean Crockett rising. News outlets scrambled to catch up, splicing together coverage as anchors abandoned scripted segments to comment on the sudden groundswell. Talk radio lit up with callers, many older, many lifelong skeptics of politics in general, who now spoke with shaking voices about dignity, about justice, about finally feeling seen. In churches, in union halls, in the back rows of public libraries, the same scenes played out. Heads bent together over glowing screens, the flickering image of Jasmine Crockett standing tall, refusing to be belittled, refusing to let truth be twisted. And it wasn't just her defense of facts that struck a chord. It was the way she carried herself, calm, firm, with the quiet ferocity of someone who knew too well the weight of silence, but chose instead to speak anyway. In living rooms lined with family photos, men and women over 50, those who had marched, those who had stayed silent and regretted it, those who had believed and been disappointed too many times, sat up a little straighter. They recognized something in her, not perfection, not politics, but purpose. And for the first time in a long time, many felt that old, aching ember of hope flicker back to life. Back in the chamber, Jasmine continued speaking, unaware of the wildfire she had ignited outside those marble walls. But beyond the security checkpoints and polished floors, across towns and cities she might never visit, her voice was carrying over divisions, over cynicism, over despair, carrying home. As Jasmine Crockett stood at the heart of the chamber, her voice weaving truth into the marble and mahogany around her, it became impossible not to feel the echoes stirring. Though she spoke with her own cadence, with words born from her own battles, there was something older moving through her, something that reached beyond the walls of Congress and into the deeper current of American history. It wasn't her voice alone that filled the room. It was the reverberation of countless voices that had come before her, each daring to speak when silence would have been safer. In a grainy black and white memory stitched into the national consciousness, Martin Luther King Jr. once stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, his voice steady against the roar of injustice. He did not shout to be heard. He spoke with the calm authority of a man who knew that history bends for those who refuse to break. That same quiet, unyielding force now radiated from Jasmine, not in mimicry, but in shared spirit. There was a flash of Shirley Chisholm, the first Black woman to seek a major party's nomination for president, standing behind a battered podium declaring, "I am not the candidate of Black America, although I am Black and proud. I am not the candidate of the women's movement of this country, although I am a woman. I am the candidate of the people." Jasmine carried that same expansive defiance, the refusal to be reduced, the insistence on claiming the fullness of her humanity in the face of every attempt to diminish it. And woven still deeper into the fabric of her stand was Thurgood Marshall, standing before a skeptical Supreme Court, arguing that separate could never be equal. Marshall had not shouted, he had not railed. He had laid out his case with a clarity that made injustice impossible to ignore. Jasmine, too, wielded facts like a scalpel, peeling away the pretense to reveal the raw truth beneath. The parallels were not forced, they were not heavy-handed, they simply lived there, breathing just beneath the surface of the moment, as natural as a river following its course. Jasmine was not trying to be a symbol. She was not posturing for cameras or carving her place in history through grandstanding. She was simply doing what every great defender of justice has done, standing, speaking, refusing to yield when it would be so much easier to sit quietly and let the world go on unchanged. As Americans across the country continued to watch, some in reverent silence, some with hands clenched into fists of hope, the narrative crystallized. This was not just another political clash. This was a continuation of the same battle that had been fought in courtrooms, on bridges, in buses, and at lunch counters. It was a reminder, vital and visceral, that progress is neither inevitable nor permanent. It must be demanded, fought for, defended with every generation. History isn't made by the loudest. It's made by the bravest. And on that day, in that chamber, before cameras and skeptics and silent witnesses, Jasmine Crockett stood among the brave. The weight of the room pressed inward, a dense and palpable force, as Jasmine Crockett stood in the center of it all, still, composed, and unshakable. Every eye was on her, every breath seemed to pause, hanging in that fragile space between confrontation and revelation. Even the cameras had gone still, as if realizing instinctively that what was about to be spoken needed no framing, no enhancement. It would carry its own gravity. Jasmine let the silence stretch, knowing that sometimes the spaces between words spoke louder than the words themselves. She stood not as a politician seeking applause, not as an adversary savoring victory, but as a witness bearing truth. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower now, steadier, every syllable weighted with something deeper than argument, something closer to prayer. "I have listened," she began, her eyes sweeping slowly across the rows of faces, "to every justification, every distortion, every carefully polished attempt to deny what we all know to be true." She took a breath, calm and measured. "We sit here in chambers built to protect the people, yet too often we forget who the people truly are. Not just the wealthy, not just the powerful, not just those whose names we already know." Her gaze hardened slightly, but her tone remained composed. "The people include the single mother working 2 jobs who can't afford a day off, the disabled veteran navigating a system designed to forget him, the young activist told to wait his turn, the elder still waiting for promises made decades ago to finally be honored." The chamber had gone utterly silent. Not a shuffle, not a cough, not a whisper. Even Mike Johnson, who had spent the morning trying to dominate the room, now sat rigid and still, his face an inscrutable mask. But Jasmine could see the cracks, the flicker of his eyes, the set of his jaw, the way his hands gripped the edge of the desk just a little too tightly. Jasmine pressed forward, her voice softening even further, becoming something almost intimate, as if she spoke to each soul individually. "The future isn't a privilege to protect," she said, her words clear, deliberate, each one ringing like a bell in the silence. "It's a promise to keep." The line fell into the room like a stone into deep water, and the ripples of it traveled outward, beyond the chamber, beyond the cameras, beyond the politics and the posturing. It was not just a statement, it was a reminder, a reckoning, a challenge. And no one, not even those most inclined to dismiss her, could pretend they hadn't heard it. Mike Johnson lowered his head. It was not a grand collapse, not a dramatic surrender. It was quieter than that, heavier. The gesture of a man who understood, finally, that he had lost something more profound than an argument. He had lost the confidence that his old strategies would always be enough. He had been confronted not just with opposition, but with undeniable truth, and there was no clever phrasing, no strategic sarcasm, no well-timed applause that could cover the emptiness now laid bare. Jasmine stood for a moment longer, letting the silence settle completely. Then, without a flourish or a dramatic exit, she simply nodded to the chair, signaling she had said all that needed to be said. She turned, walking back to her seat, her steps measured, grounded, carrying with her the quiet, immense authority of someone who had spoken not for herself, but for the countless unseen and unheard who now, finally had a voice in that hallowed hall. The gavel struck once, sharp against the podium, signaling the formal adjournment of the session, but no one moved. No hurried scraping of chairs, no eager rustle of papers, no rush toward exits. Instead, the members of Congress, their aides, the gallery spectators, all remained seated, wrapped in a silence so dense it felt almost sacred. It was as if some invisible weight had settled over the room, pressing everyone into a shared understanding that something significant, something irreversible, had just occurred. Jasmine Crockett remained at her seat, her hands folded calmly before her posture relaxed but still alert. She was not basking. She was not grandstanding. She simply was, rooted, steady, allowing the magnitude of the moment to exist without trying to control it. The cameras had pulled back now, wide-angle shots capturing the stillness that spoke louder than any closing statement could have. Outside the chamber, the world churned with reactions. But here, within these storied walls, there was only reflection. Slowly, almost tentatively, a few members began to rise, not to leave, but to approach her. A senior Democrat, his tie loosened, his face drawn with a fatigue that seemed to fall away in the presence of something so honest, stepped forward first. He extended his hand, firm and wordless, the pressure of his grip saying what his mouth could not. Jasmine rose and accepted it, offering a nod that carried gratitude but not surprise. She had not spoken today for applause or validation. She had spoken because silence was no longer an option. Another approached, a younger representative from across the aisle, whose career had been built carefully on calculated neutrality. He hesitated for a breath, as if weighing the political consequences of what he was about to do, then reached out his hand as well. Jasmine accepted it with the same quiet dignity, making no assumptions, offering no judgments. In that moment, politics melted away, and what remained was something simpler and older. One human acknowledging another's courage. A few more followed, some with murmured thank yous, some with nothing but a glance held a second too long, full of meaning. Even those who remained seated seemed caught in the pull of the moment, their silence a kind of reverence, a recognition that the air itself had been changed by what had passed between these walls. Mike Johnson remained at his desk for a long time, staring at nothing in particular. When he finally stood, he did so without looking toward Jasmine, gathering his papers with mechanical slowness, the swagger that had once marked his presence gone. No words of concession were offered, none were expected. Some defeats are too complete for speeches. As the room slowly began to exhale, papers gathered, conversations resumed in hushed tones. Jasmine allowed herself a brief moment to close her eyes just once, feeling the gravity of the day settle into her bones. She thought not of victory, but of responsibility, the weight of having carried voices larger than her own, the solemnity of knowing the fight was far from over. When she opened her eyes again, the chamber was moving around her, but the axis had shifted. Power, once hoarded and wielded by a few, had today found a new center, however briefly. And though the world outside would rush to spin and narrate and politicize what had just transpired, Jasmine knew that the truth of it, the real truth, lived not in headlines or viral clips, but in the quiet reverence that had filled the room after the words had ended. And that was enough. The door closed behind her with a soft, decisive click, sealing Jasmine Crockett away from the blinding cameras, the hushed awe of the chamber, the world momentarily orbiting her like a newly discovered star. In the quiet backstage room, a space furnished with nothing more than a worn table, a scattering of chairs, and a lingering scent of coffee gone cold, she finally allowed herself to exhale. The breath trembled on its way out, the first crack in the fortress she had held firm for hours. Her team was already there, waiting, not with champagne or roaring applause, but with the kind of watchful, reverent silence that speaks of deep respect. One of her aides, a young woman, not long out of law school, stood frozen with a tablet still in her hand, news alerts cascading across the screen like falling rain. Another, older and more seasoned, offered a tight, knowing nod, the barest flicker of pride crossing his face. No words were necessary, not yet. Jasmine leaned against the edge of the table, her legs grateful for the respite, her heart still hammering a defiant rhythm against her ribs. The exhaustion hit her in waves now, heavy and insistent, the toll of emotional restraint, of tactical patience, of standing exposed yet unyielding before judgmental eyes. For a moment, the seed of doubt whispered, had she said enough? Had she said too much? Had the weight of the hopes she carried been honored? Or had she faltered somewhere invisible to the world, but glaringly clear to those she fought for? She closed her eyes briefly, feeling the swirl of it all, the doubt, the fear, the fierce pride colliding inside her chest. Vulnerability tugged at her, insistent and raw, but she knew better than to banish it. Strength was not the absence of fear. Strength was standing anyway, speaking anyway, believing anyway. A hand brushed lightly against her arm. It was her chief of staff, a woman who had seen Jasmine at her highest and her most broken. "You did good," she said simply, voice low and steady. "Not perfect, not invincible. Good, real, human, necessary." Jasmine opened her eyes and looked around at the faces that had fought beside her, believed beside her. Their exhaustion mirrored her own, but so did their resolve. She straightened slowly, pulling herself upright not because the cameras demanded it, but because the cause did. "The fight's not over," she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. Her voice was rough, scraped raw from the weight of truth, but it held. Today was one battle. There will be more. They nodded, understanding without the need for speeches. The war she was fighting was not won in a single hearing, no matter how electrifying. It was a long march, through legislation, through resistance, through fatigue and moments of doubt like this one. But for today, she had held the line. For today, she had shown the voiceless that their words could echo within the marble halls of power. A soft knock sounded at the door, a reminder that the world outside was waiting again. Reporters, constituents, critics, allies. Jasmine took one last breath, gathering herself, anchoring herself back into the purpose that had carried her this far. She didn't adjust her hair. She didn't check her makeup. She simply squared her shoulders, opened the door, and stepped back into the fray. Not as a symbol, not as a savior, but as a fighter who understood that every victory must be defended 1,000 times over. And she was ready. By the time Jasmine Crockett stepped out of the quiet shelter of the back halls and into the glaring swirl of press and flashing cameras, the story had already taken on a life of its own. News headlines raced each other across screens big and small, the language shifting from cautious political analysis to something more urgent, more human. "Crockett commands the chamber," read one. "Truth cuts through the noise," proclaimed another. Commentators scrambled to describe what they had witnessed, but no headline fully captured the current that had been unleashed. Across America, the ripples spread. On social media, Jasmine's words, sharp, clear, undiluted, traveled faster than any curated press release ever could. Clips of her rebuttal flooded timelines, stitched together with handwritten captions, heartfelt commentary, and sometimes simply silent reposts, as if no added words could do justice to the weight of what had been said. In Facebook groups frequented by veterans and working-class retirees, the videos made rounds, accompanied by personal reflections, stories of long-forgotten promises, battles fought and lost, dreams deferred but not entirely extinguished. A black grandmother in Selma posted a photo of her television screen, Jasmine mid-speech with the caption, "For my grandbabies, for all of us." A retired auto worker in Detroit, who had long ago stopped believing anyone in Washington cared about people like him, recorded a simple, shaking video. "She's the first one in a long time who talks like she remembers we're still here." A young Latino teacher in Phoenix organized a classroom discussion around Jasmine's speech, telling his students, "This is what standing up looks like." Letters began to pour into her office, tangible proof that something had shifted beyond the ephemeral metrics of views and shares. Some were formal, written on crisp letterhead from advocacy groups and community organizations. Others were handwritten in careful cursive or hurried scrawl, folded neatly into envelopes bearing stamps from small towns and sprawling cities alike. Veterans thanking her for speaking truths they felt had been buried. Elderly activists who had marched in the 60s, writing to say they had seen their dreams flicker alive again, if only briefly. Young mothers, first-time voters, community organizers, all sending pieces of themselves across the miles, stitching a patchwork quilt of gratitude, hope, and renewed resolve. Jasmine read as many as she could, often in the quiet hours when the noise of the day had faded. Each story, each testimony, fortified the realization that what had happened in that chamber was bigger than a single confrontation. It was a catalyst, the first pebble dropped into a still pond that now rippled outward in waves too wide to measure. She knew better than to mistake momentum for permanence. She understood that real change moved slower, faced resistance thicker than concrete, but she also knew that every movement began with a moment, one instant when silence was broken, when someone refused to yield, when a voice reached beyond its own throat and found its way into the hearts of others. The seeds had been sown, and somewhere, in places Jasmine might never visit, in hearts she might never meet, something had begun to grow. In the quiet hours after the chamber had emptied and the headlines had begun their fevered sprint across the nation, Jasmine Crockett sat alone in her modest office, the gravity of the day settling into her bones. Around her, the remnants of battle were scattered, half-drunk coffee, abandoned notes, a stack of letters beginning to arrive even faster than they could be sorted. The sun dipped low across Washington, casting long shadows on the marble floors, and for a moment, Jasmine allowed herself the smallest smile. Not a smile of triumph, but of acknowledgement, a nod to the long road that had led her here. She thought back to the beginning, not to her first campaign ad or her swearing in, but to the years far before that, to the cramped apartments where dreams had to be louder than circumstance, to the late nights spent studying case law while the city outside her window slept, to the moments of humiliation, the doors slammed shut, the endless condescension from those who believed that pedigree mattered more than perseverance. Every barrier had taught her something: patience, resilience, focus. Every slight had been folded into her spirit, fuel for the fire she carried now, steady and undiminished. She hadn't come to Congress to become famous. She hadn't come for power's sake. She had come because she remembered too well what it felt like to be unseen, unheard, and underestimated. And she had made herself a quiet promise that if ever she stood within the halls where decisions were made, she would carry with her not just her own voice, but the voices of all who had been told, in ways both cruel and polite, that they did not belong. Today she had honored that promise. Yet even now, in the afterglow of a confrontation that many were already calling historic, Jasmine remained grounded. She answered texts from her mother, short and proud. She sent a thank you to a local community organizer who had been one of her earliest believers, long before there were cameras and headlines. She reminded her team, half joking, that tomorrow would bring new bills, new committees, new fights. No one was allowed to get too comfortable, but if her humility anchored her, it was her conviction that lit the way forward. Jasmine knew that the victory today wasn't a final one. It was a flare fired into a long, dark night, a marker signaling that the fight was far from over. She was prepared not just to speak truth to power, but to shape power with truth, to transform it, to make it answer to the ideals it claimed to serve. The night outside deepened, but Jasmine felt no fatigue now, only a deep, burning clarity. Her journey from the overlooked daughter of a working-class neighborhood to a figure standing tall amid the marble colonnades of Congress was never about her alone. It was about every unseen, underestimated soul whose dreams deserved to be fought for. And fight she would, tomorrow and the next day, and every day after, because some fires, once lit, refused to go out. Morning in Washington carried a different kind of tension. Not the heavy, sluggish tension of yesterday's confrontation, but a sharper, keener edge. The kind that comes when the dust has barely settled, and already the next fight looms on the horizon. Jasmine Crockett stood by the window of her office, a stack of legislative briefs on the table behind her. The city sprawled out in front of her like a chessboard waiting for its next move. Victory had never been a destination. It was a mile marker, a reminder that every step forward revealed new terrains of struggle. Even now, even after the echoes of her words still reverberated through newsrooms and households across the country, Jasmine knew that far subtler, far more insidious battles awaited her. Not every opponent would be as overt as Mike Johnson. Some would smile warmly while sharpening knives behind closed doors. Some would couch their resistance in bureaucracy, in technicalities, in procedures designed to sap strength and patience. They would not all raise their voices. Some would simply wait for the moment when attention faded, when fatigue set in, when the urgency of justice could be quietly filed away under unfinished business. Jasmine smiled faintly at the thought. Let them wait. She was not a creature of the spotlight. She did not burn out when the headlines dimmed. Her fuel came from deeper places, older promises. She turned back to her desk, scanning the top document on the pile, a draft bill aimed at expanding access to voting rights in historically disenfranchised communities. Beneath it, another proposal addressing systemic inequities in healthcare access. Further down, a project tackling predatory lending practices in minority neighborhoods. Each page represented a battlefield. Each signature gathered, each amendment fought for, each coalition built from scratch would demand more than fiery speeches. It would demand endurance, strategy, relentless resolve, and Jasmine welcomed it. If yesterday's confrontation had proven anything, it was that she had the resilience to stand in the storm, and the wisdom to know that real change required more than a single moment of defiance. It demanded the slow, grinding work of building, stone by imperfect stone, the foundation for something better. Her team filtered into the office, coffee in hand, the faint marks of exhaustion still lingering under their eyes. They carried updates, agendas, schedules packed tight with meetings and hearings and late-night strategy sessions. Jasmine greeted them with a nod, already moving into action. There was no fanfare here, no basking in yesterday's light, only the steady drumbeat of purpose. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, rolled her shoulders once to shake off the last remnants of sleep, and picked up the first file. Somewhere in the city, beyond the corridors of power, voices were rising, calling, pleading, demanding that yesterday's words not be allowed to fade into history like so many others before them. And Jasmine Crockett was determined to answer, ready to fight smarter, ready to fight longer, ready to fight harder. Because she understood more clearly than ever that justice was not a prize to be won. It was a home to be built, and she was just getting started. Somewhere beyond the marble columns and iron gates of Congress, morning unfurled itself across America. In small towns and sprawling cities, in quiet neighborhoods and bustling streets, people stirred, some still clutching memories of the words they had heard the day before. others just beginning to catch whispers of the fire that had been lit. Jasmine Crockett stood on the front steps of the Capitol, a slender figure silhouetted against the rising sun, her posture relaxed but her presence unmistakable. The air carried a different charge now, not the fragile hush of stunned silence, nor the frantic buzz of fleeting outrage. It was something steadier, deeper, a slow, inevitable momentum gathering strength with each breath, each heartbeat. The kind of movement that didn't burn itself out in a single blaze but smoldered, patient and persistent, refusing to die. The narrator's voice, steady, low, timeless, rose quietly over the scene, weaving itself into the morning air like a thread of memory and hope. A spark in Congress today, a blaze across America tomorrow. The words didn't shout. They didn't need to. They settled over the landscape like a promise, whispered from one generation to the next, carried in the hearts of all who understood that true change never begins with fanfare. It begins with a single voice refusing to echo the silence. It begins with one step taken forward when standing still would be safer. It begins when one person, against all the weight of history, decides that the future will not be inherited. It will be made. Jasmine took a breath, feeling the cool air fill her lungs, tasting the crispness of possibility. Her mind flickered briefly back to the chamber, to Mike Johnson's bowed head, to the silent reverence of her colleagues, to the ripple she had felt begin to spread even as she walked away from the podium. But she didn't linger there. Today wasn't about victory laps. It was about what came next. Behind her, the Capitol stood as it always had, grand, imposing, battered by centuries of compromise and conflict. But Jasmine understood now, more deeply than ever, that its true strength didn't lie in its walls. It lay in the hands of those willing to challenge them when necessary, in the hearts of those who refused to accept that justice was finished being written. She glanced once at the crowd beginning to gather beyond the gates, citizens, reporters, curious onlookers, faces young and old, hopeful and skeptical, all drawn by the gravitational pull of a moment larger than any one person. Jasmine smiled, not for them, not for the cameras, but for herself, for the girl she had once been, who had dared to believe that she could stand here someday and speak not for power, but for promise. Then she stepped forward, moving down the marble steps, her head high, her stride unhurried. Not toward applause, not toward adulation, but toward the work still waiting to be done, the meetings, the negotiations, the lonely fights, the small victories that stitch themselves into something larger over time. The sun broke fully over the horizon now, bathing the city in gold, casting Jasmine's shadow long across the stone. It followed her as she walked, a silent companion to the fire she carried inside her, an ember that would not go out, not today, not tomorrow, not ever. And across America, in places she might never see, hands were already reaching for torches, hearts already catching flame. The fire had been lit, and it would not be extinguished. True change doesn't come from shouting the loudest or wielding the most power. It comes from standing firm in your truth, even when it would be easier to stay silent. Jasmine Crockett's story reminds us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it, that every quiet act of defiance, every refusal to yield, carries the potential to ignite a movement. You don't have to be famous to make a difference. You only have to decide that silence is no longer an option. Today, what truth will you choose to stand for, even if you must stand alone? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Noah's Justice Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Noah's Justice Stories.